First of all, I would like to apologize that I was unable to share with you the morning sessions, and I will not be able to share with you the afternoon sessions because of the way the university is structured and the multiple obligations that one has ex officio as the head of the Center of Contemporary Jewry. And today, actually, a very, very interesting and I think kind of celebrating event is taking place in the Mandel Center of Jewish Studies in the Hebrew University. It's called Scholion, and it's a contest of young, promising, extremely talented, gifted PhDs who are applying for a postdoc, a very generous postdoc fellowship of 2 to 3 years in Scholion, which is really very generous and very special in the Israeli, not only in the Israeli academic life. But we had over 60 applications. We chose 2. 10 were on the short list, and in this morning they were presenting their work. And now we are going to interview all of them and then to select. And as the academic committee, which I am a member because of my role as the head of the center, I can't avoid it. We also have one of our candidates, but it's really an amazing young group of people. And I think that each of us should be extremely happy to see how many good and original and innovative young people and their approach to Jewish studies. It's really a promise for the future. The only problem is that the universities cannot really absorb them. And, you know, this country is full of young talents. I'm not exaggerating. It's really amazing. I mean, I do it now the 3rd year. Gidi did it before me. And I think he can testify that I'm not exaggerating. So, so please take my apology. According to the program, they will end. We should end there earlier than here, so I will come, but if you know how things go, it will not happen. I really would like to thank all of you and for this wonderful conference, and we will be in touch with all the lecturers because we do hope to publish the conference, not as a proceeding, but as articles, and we will be in touch with all of you. You can see from the program that we dedicated this, Shalom Su. We dedicated this session to the memory of Seymour Fax, who I was really very, very attached to personally, and therefore I took the liberty to ask to say a few words about Seymour Fax. This is certainly not the form that will be dedicated to Seymour Fax. It's only taking the opportunity that I felt and my colleagues in the Institute of Contemporary Jewry and in the Melton Center for Jewish Education felt that at least we should do this. And please let me read a few things that I prepared for this. Only in July 10th, 2006, barely half a year ago, the dreadful information of the death of Seymour Fax came with thunder in a clear day. It was utterly unexpected and in a way far from being real. Seymour was so vivid, active, full of plans and ideas. In the last year, I consulted with him regularly on issues that concern the Institute of Contemporary Jewry. When we planned this session on education, we thought the Seymour Fax would share it. The dedication of this session in his memory is only a token of how I personally and all our colleagues in the Institute and in the Center for Jewish Education cherish his memory. I will start with the personal before I move to say a few words about the achievements of Seymour Fax in the field of Jewish education. My first meeting with Fax was in 1973. I just completed my master's. Seymour Fax was then the head of the School of Education, and together with the late Professor Tzvi Lam, he initiated a new program of teachers training. He was interviewing the candidates from amongst the high school teachers to be the tutors, and I was accepted as a tutor for the teaching of history. His only question was, to me in the interview, why do I want to teach how to teach history? And I replied, it is interesting. This was enough for Seymour, which shows something very, very deep in the way or in the insight that Seymour had, realizing the honesty in this respect of people. The next time, in 1982, he interviewed me after I have already completed my PhD. He wanted to be sure about my commitment to education before he offered that I will join the staff of the Melton Center. Since then, I could always rely on his support and good advices. I often took advantage of his wisdom and experience, in particular in the last 2 years as chairperson of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry. Seymour Fax was born on November 17, 1929, in Chicago, one of 4 children to immigrant parents from Poland. After excelling in his early studies at public school and yet at yeshiva, where he received a traditional Jewish education, he went on to enroll as a pre-med student in a college, while earning a Bachelor of Hebrew Literature in Jewish Teacher Certification at Chicago's College of Jewish Studies. It was there that he was profoundly influenced by the Jewish philosopher Shimon Ravidovich. Fax ultimately left medical school to pursue the study of education at the University of Chicago. His doctoral studies were guided by his mentor and the philosopher of education and curriculum specialist Joseph Schwab, that as students we really learned Schwab from top to bottom, from side to side, and it was really part of our curriculum very intensively, to whom he remained a loyal disciple for the rest of his life. Seeking to improve the field of Jewish education, the Chancellor of Jewish Theological Seminary of America, Louis Finkelstein, invited Fax to participate in the Rabbinical Studies program. Studying with leading Jewish scholars and thinkers such as Shaul Lieberman, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and Mordechai Kaplan, Fax received his ordination in 1956 and was subsequently appointed assistant professor in education at the Teachers Institute of the Rabbinical School, where he was later to become dean. From 1954 to 1966, he took charge of the Ramah Summer Camp movement, developing the camp's educational ideals and practices, infusing campers and staff alike through his gift of bringing scholars and communities together, even electrifying both. For many thousands of youth, Camp Ramah was a formative experience in shaping their commitment to Judaism and to the Jewish people, and in launching their own leadership in Jewish community. In addition, in 1960, Fax established the pivotal Center for Jewish Educational Initiative in the United States, in the JTS, the Melton Research Center for Jewish Education. After a short term as visiting professor at the School of Education at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1966, he decided to remain in Israel and was appointed the head of the school, a position he held for 14 years. Last April, when we had the 10th commemoration for late Professor Davis, who established this, the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, Seymour Fax was talking, and was relating to his deep and important contacts and relationship with Professor Moshe Davis, and why his coming to Israel was also influenced by the wish of Professor Davis and Professor Rosenstreich at the time, who was the rector, I think, of the university, that he would come to Israel and settle here, although, as he testified, he never thought about it before. And I must say that thinking of Shimon Ravidovich as one of his philosophers, one can understand that, you know, Bavel and Yerushalayim would be the two centers, but that he moved finally to Yerushalayim. In this capacity, Fax invited leading educational scholars from America to contribute to Israeli education, introduced new programs in early childhood education and curriculum writing. He established the Research Institute for the Innovation in Education and the Melton Center for Jewish Education in the diaspora at that time in Jewish education, the name of the center today. Fax also helped shape Israeli educational policy in his role as advisor to four of Israel's ministers of education, his active membership in Council of Higher Education, and his chairmanship of the Committee of the Accreditation of Teachers Training Colleges. He had lots of stories to tell about Aran, about each of the ministers of education, and I must say that one of the stories that I remember in one of our meetings in the spring, he described how Aran called him in the middle of the night when he was so worried. He read compositions, chiburim, of Israeli kids in elementary school, and he realized how little Jewish culture or whatever Jewish elements are in their chiburim, in their compositions, and then the program to deepen the Jewish education in the Israeli school setting was developed. In 1983, Fax proposed a program to train Jewish educational leaders for Jewish communities in the diaspora, the Jerusalem Fellow, in conjunction with the Jewish Agency and prominent scholars, researchers, and planners, and policymakers from the field of education and Jewish studies. Its graduates have gone on to hold key positions in Jewish education in Israel and communities around the world. When Morton Mandel of Cleveland, Ohio, was invited to serve as chairman of the Jewish Agency's Committee on Education, he appointed Fax to his senior policy advisor. Their collaboration intensified and grew from then on. Fax's collaboration with Mandel then led to the establishment of what has become the largest foundation of Jewish education in the Jewish world, in the founding of the Mandel Leadership Institute, based in Jerusalem. Mandel Leadership Institute provided programs in the training of educational leaders and social entrepreneurs, and I think that Varda, she's not here, Varda Rafaeli, you were on the, right? Were you on the program? No, I thought that you were on the program. Including the Mandel Jerusalem Fellow, the Mandel School of Educational Leadership, and others. In 1991, Fax also initiated and headed the project of the foundation dedicated to the development of new visions in Jewish education for Israel and for the Jewish communities throughout the world. This project was guided by Fax's novel conception of philosophy of education as a resource discipline for the improvement of educational practice. The initiative culminated in the publication of Vision of Jewish Education, published Cambridge University Press in 2003. Since then, Fax integrated the Vision project as an ongoing component of the Mandel Foundation programs and activities. You know, I feel that I don't know how to end it, and I think that this is what we feel the way Seymour's life ended. It was something that we just cannot describe, comprehend. It seems to me unreal until now. I didn't mention that for a number of years I was working together with Sue Fax when I headed the Center for the Research, the International Center for the Research of Anti-Semitism, and Sue was the director of this center. And this was another capacity that we had a lot of talks about the Jewish people and where are we going. So I will end now and would pass the chair as it is planned in the program. Thank you very much.
I think the most appropriate response is to actually talk about education. I'm Shlomi Ravid. I'm here on behalf of the newly founded International School for Jewish Peoplehood Studies at Beth Hatefutsoth, founded by the Nadav Fund, who also sponsored this conference. And many of the speakers in the last 2 days said something about their relationship with Gidi. I think that the new twist that we're going to bring into the room is that while they spoke of things having taken place in the past, we're going to talk about things happening in the present and in the future. In a way, we got lucky, and we have Gidi as our academic consultant for the School of Jewish Peoplehood. So the locals' loss is our gain. And we definitely look forward for a lot of very creative and successful yozmot, initiatives that we will do together. Yeah, it's interesting. This maybe we'll say something about language. It was referred to in the first day of the conference. The key question that the conference, and we're actually at the point that we can start reflecting on the conference itself, challenged us with, is the contemporary peoplehood of Jews, myth or reality. After nearly 48 hours of lectures, I'm not sure that I'm ready to take off the question mark and say, is it a myth, a reality, a combination of the two, none of the two? I feel that I leave this place with a sense that peoplehood is a complicated question, that it's in a flux, that based on some of the lectures, a serious cause for worry. Moving into the sphere of educators, I actually think that we need to reframe the question. And I think that our challenge as educator, and I'm putting this challenge in front of the panel, but also all of you, I think we're in this business together, is to actually figure out the question of what could or what would Jewish peoplehood mean in the 21st century, especially for the generation growing in the 21st century. It is a very, very serious question. And if we figure out that question, us educators, we then need to move on to the next question of how does peoplehood pedagogy look like? In other words, how do we teach for Jewish peoplehood? Unfortunately, Zeev could not be with us this afternoon, so I'm going to turn the phone over, not the phone, the microphone over to Alan. One of the things I discovered in this conference is there are a few secret, important clubs that you have to belong to be established here. Well, first of all, you have to be a Habonim alumni and secretary of the movement. Then you have to be on the Machon leMadrichei Chutz La'aretz. I mean, otherwise, what right do you have? By the way, all you Habonim folks, I was a Habonim Shaliach, so please, let's have some respect. But beyond those very important things, Alan has served as the Director General of the Jewish Agency's Education Department. He has dedicated his life to promoting Jewish education, serving as the Director of the Hadassah Youth Activities in Israel, Director of the Melton Center for Jewish Education in the Diaspora, Executive Director of the Council for Initiatives in Jewish Education, and the head of the Mandel Center for Jewish Continuity at Hebrew University. So it gives me great pleasure to invite my friend and colleague, Alan.
Toda, Shlomi. Zeev is unfortunately not able to be with us here this afternoon, so I am going to steal a couple of minutes to say something personal before talking about the topic of my paper. I joined Habonim in South Africa late in life. In 1963, I was saying Kaddish for my late father, and as someone hinted, I think it was Zeev last night, Wolfie, one of the unique things about Habonim South Africa was that there was a minyan at the Habonim camp, and a mutual friend, Mike Cooper, who not too many people here know, invited me to come as a madrich to that camp, which ultimately changed, I think, completely the course of my life. And I think within about 24 hours of being a madrich thrown into this camp in Onrust, the first South African Habonim camp in Onrust near Cape Town, a bunch of people who had come back from the Machon Madrichei Chutz Laaretz came back telling the stories, the mythological stories of Gidi Shimoni, who I had not known as a madrich in Habonim because he was already had made Aliyah, but it was clear to me from the very moment that I stepped into this movement that Gidi's presence had been a overwhelming educational presence in that movement. And within a couple of years, I became the Maskir HaChinuch of Habonim, and then following in Gidi and Wolfie's, Ev Mankowitz's footsteps, the Maskir Klali of the movement. And I was very, very lucky that Gidi and Tony were back in South Africa exactly during that period, and we had an opportunity to work very intensely together. And I believe that that short period of working together with Gidi and thinking about what does it mean to think about educational content and how to be both serious about education and at the same time committed and passionate ideologically was a very, very formative part of my life. And I'm very, very delighted to be here. And pretty amazed, Gidi, that you are that this is a kenos that celebrates your going to pension, although I am sure just an opportunity for you to rev up the parts of your academic career that you really want to do. I should tell you all, by the way, that during the time that Gidi and Tony were in South Africa, Tony and I worked together in the Habonim office, and Tony set the standard for speed and intelligence that I have never been able to match in all my quests for people who've worked for me. And there are many people in this room who know how hard and how difficult I've been in trying to meet that bar. So I'm very, I think that I'm delighted to be able to be present here at this session. And in 1980, when I came back from 3 years of graduate school in the States, Mike Rosenak and Seymour Fox made a meeting with me and invited me to join the Melton Center for Jewish Education, then called In the Diaspora, which I'm delighted to say we took the In the Diaspora off eventually, and began close to 18 years of my association with this university and with the Melton Center, and particularly working b'mechitzato in the close to Seymour Fox, who I think that in the same way as Habonim of Giddy, with the values and the education and educational informal tradition that I think always remained part of me. I think that working with Seymour was probably amongst the most formative things that I ever did in Jewish education. And I don't come very often these days to Beit Meyersdorf. And without this incredibly vivid and alive photograph that you have here in front of you. But even before that, as I came up the stairs to the opening presentation of Michael Walzer, my mind was crowded, my mind and my heart were crowded with associations of the number of hours that Seymour and I and different constellations of people, many of whom are in this room, Mike, spent in this very building, dreaming up, discussing, tearing apart ideas and plans and projects for Jewish education, including the Senior Educators Program that was born in this building, and the Melton Adult Mini School that was born in these conference rooms, or Revivim in later years, all of which Seymour was a driving force or a thought partner, and it is still impossible for me to actually believe that we are here for a session in memory of Seymour and that he is not actually around. And I'm so delighted to see Sue here in the audience. So for me, this session is a session that brings together much of my life, and I want to now go into the topic, which is our topic of Israel in Jewish peoplehood education. When we talk about Jewish people education, the topic that I was asked to speak about is the place of Israel within Jewish peoplehood education. The issues facing the Jewish people today are unprecedented. Barely 3 generations ago, Jews throughout the world, most of whom were immigrants, I'm talking about our grandparents and some of our great-grandparents, struggled for basic economic and sometimes physical security. These external threats, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, often prevented the Jewish community, Jewish communities, from fully confronting modernity and its impact on Jewish life. But today it is true to say that while Jews throughout the world have achieved with unparalleled success the basic economic and physical security they once lacked and gone way beyond that, an entirely new set of issues has emerged. And we've heard a lot about these issues at this conference. Within a century, contemporary Jewish communities have managed to realize many of their grandparents' dreams. In the wake of these incredible successes, new threats to the survival of the Jewish people have emerged. For the first time, Jews have the opportunity to choose to be Jewish. Whereas in the past, Jews were still identified and labeled as Jews by the outside society, even if they chose not to affiliate with Judaism in any way, Jews today can opt out of Jewish affiliation and identification completely. Being Jewish today is most often voluntary. As every demographic study undertaken in the last couple of decades has shown, many young Jews are choosing not to affiliate. We are told, for example, that on campuses today in North America or in the United States, close to half of the Jewish students only have one Jewish parent. Among global Jewish communities, only Israel has a birth rate high enough to lead to generate population growth. So that beyond the shrinking number of Jews in the world, we're also witnessing a growing detachment, especially of young people, from the organized Jewish community. Communal involvement is rapidly decreasing, and recent studies show that although young Jews are often concerned with spirituality and their own personal Jewish identities, the modern emphasis on the individual has weakened their interest in participating both in organized religion and in Jewish collectivity. At the same time, there is also a marked decline in the connection to Israel, particularly among younger people. Steve Cohen's latest study, or one of his latest studies, every indicator shows marked distancing between world Jewry and Israel, with a growing gap that could ultimately threaten to create two separate Jewish peoples. So that being Jewish today is voluntary, and this is where we begin to come to education and the role of education. Young Jews today need motivation to be Jewish. No longer does society force it on them, and no longer is having Jewish parents enough to ensure that the children will remain committed Jews. The argument is that the concept of Jewish peoplehood, the instinctive feeling that one is a member of one Jewish people present around the world, a concept which encompasses all aspects of Jewish culture, including history, homeland, religion, spirituality. Jewish peoplehood could offer a fresh and exciting entry point for many young people. Not only that, is it argued, but it is potentially a concept around which Jews globally can unify. So that Jewish education would have the potential to revolutionize and maybe reinvigorate Judaism in today's modern world, building itself through this notion and this frame of Jewish peoplehood. I've listened carefully to the sessions that I've attended at this conference, to the different ways in which Jewish peoplehood has been used and has been understood. And although the value of a sense of connectedness becomes especially important as collective bonds weaken in general society and amongst Jews, I have a sense from this conference that we have a danger which is lurking there in the shadows, a danger which I think is especially important when we have a session like this that deals with education and Jewish peoplehood. And the danger that I want to point to is that in some of the presentations, I sense that Jewish peoplehood is used as a kind of tent, the broadest possible tent with which to incorporate the notion of what could be common to Jews around the world, what my third grade or fourth grade arithmetic teacher called a lowest common denominator idea of Jewish peoplehood. And my fear, as I think about the educational implications of this idea of Jewish peoplehood, is that lowest common denominator Jewish peoplehood may not be a robust and strong enough idea to sustain Jewish life if we're going to talk about it educationally. So that I think that the issue that we have to try to grapple with as we think about the educational potential of Jewish peoplehood, as a Beit Hatefutsoth sets up a school for Jewish peoplehood, is how do we move this notion of Jewish peoplehood from a lowest common denominator idea to what I think was called in arithmetic a highest common multiple idea. How do we define the minimal conditions of what it means to be an active member of this people? What contents, acts, or behaviors could create the commonalities that give young Jews an active rather than a passive meaning when we talk about the notion of Jewish peoplehood? Mike Rosenak, in a previous conversation on this topic, talked about descriptive Jewish peoplehood as opposed to prescriptive Jewish peoplehood. And I hope, Mike, I'm not stealing any thunder from your presentation, but I think that this is exactly the issue. If we're going to talk about Jewish peoplehood as an educational concept, we have to, I think about what do we mean by highest common denominator Jewish peoplehood? What would it mean? Are we talking about mitzvot of Jewish peoplehood? And how does one move from the prescriptive to the descriptive to the prescriptive in this area? As I'm an educator, I suppose an article of my faith is that education in all societies has a unique ability to shape people and to shape societies. Larry Kremen, who some of you knew better than I, a good Jew who was the president of Teachers College at Columbia, talked about education as the deliberate, systematic, and sustained effort to transmit, evoke, acquire knowledge, values, skills, or sensibilities. This transmitting of culture across generations, as he called it, provides the broadest definition of education, expanding the borders beyond classrooms filled with children. Adults touring old synagogues in Prague, teenagers creating a mock Knesset, children learning Zionist songs from the 1930s are all examples of transmitting culture. The Jewish community's belief in education stems from this expanded understanding of the word. The transformative power of education lies in its ability to both provide knowledge, but also in its ability to inspire, motivate, and generate passion. Jewish education, especially, I will argue, with Israel at its center, is about the transmission of substance, but also the deep experience and passion of culture. Education can enhance the feeling of Jewish peoplehood and allow a young person to develop their own personal passion for Judaism, and through that the answer to why be Jewish. For education to have the desired impact on shaping the future, three major elements are necessary: inspiring educators, compelling content, and transformative experiences. These three ingredients are not only necessary separately, but interdependently as well. Educators are entrusted with transmitting culture across generations, as well as the knowledge of and passion for content and for one's roots. And yet we know that once a highly valued profession in the Jewish community, education now occupies a low rung on the Jewish occupational ladder. Following the trend of the world at large, the people of the book has steadily devalued the importance of teachers in the broadest sense of the word. In fact, outside of the ultra-Orthodox world, rarely do we hear of Jewish parents pushing their children to get a teaching degree. The Jewish world invests too little resources in educators. Day school teachers, Hebrew school teachers, and informal educators' salaries are not commensurate with the burden we place on them of ensuring the Jewish future. Moreover, there are not nearly enough quality institutions to train and develop formal and informal educators. While inspiring educators are one important ingredient in exciting young people, they need compelling content to use in their teaching in various settings. Curriculum development, in tune with modern reality and suited to address increasingly individualized needs, is sorely lacking. Traditional text study, while appealing to many, is not the answer for everyone. At the same time, today's youth yearns for meaning and for substance. The Jewish tradition and culture is rich with a multitude of deep and important ideas, yet so few know how to access and enter into dialogue with these texts and traditions. The Jewish educational world is not kept up with modern advances that allow for easy and efficient sharing of creative resources. Technology provides an opportunity to forge technological bridges between Jewish communities and share expertise. Emerging technologies form the language of young people today. One needs only to look at the popularity of websites like Heb magazine or Juicy to see that counterculture Jews have already found a home in these sites. There is a significant potential here for connecting young Jews, of which we must begin to take advantage. Exciting and stimulating educators and deep content are still not enough. We need to create educational arenas which engender passion and enthusiasm in all sectors of Jewish society. In a voluntary world where one must choose to be Jewish, the issue of motivation is central. Without providing a compelling answer to the question of why be Jewish and how does Jewishness speak to my guts, educators will be unable to fulfill their mission. Transformative experiences create the moments that waken young people from their self-centered reverie and stimulate the deep need to connect. Educators, materials, and experiences. 3 ingredients necessary to engage young people with their identity. 3 ingredients often lacking in today's Jewish community. I want to suggest that Israel can go some way to providing educational resources that will respond to these 3 major areas. The shortage of educators is a problem that must be solved both in the long and the short term. Ultimately, of course, the answer is for communities to grow their own quality educators who are sensitive to local needs and to the cultural issues. Globally, some regions have been more successful in this endeavor than others. In fact, in the 15 years since the Mandel Commission sounded the alarm in A Time to Act, and here is another opportunity to mention Seymour's seminal contribution, not only to conceptualizing the Mandel Commission and bringing out the cri de coeur of A Time to Act, but essentially putting the issue of Jewish personnel and Jewish educators on the agenda of the world Jewish community. Since that time, some attention has been paid to this challenge, and some significant achievements have been made. I want to suggest that it's in this arena that Israel can and is already a huge resource for responding to this central issue in Jewish education. Today there are well over 300 teachers, Israeli teachers, who spend between 3 to 5 years in diaspora communities. Schools like Chat in Toronto have as many as 20 teachers, probably the biggest Jewish high school in the world, 20 Israeli teachers in one school. This is a mixed blessing, but one of the questions that needs to be asked is there a way in which the huge educational resources of Israel could actually be mobilized successfully or more successfully to serve the needs of Jewish education worldwide? A better example are the just under 2,000 young Israelis who serve as counselors in Jewish camps every summer throughout the world, 1,500 of them in North America. These counselors, who serve as informal educators around both the contents of Judaism and Israel touch over 150,000 young Jews each year. In the past 5 years, under the banner of Arevim, a Jewish version of Teach for America, close to 450 young Israelis are at this very moment spending between a year and 2 years in Jewish communities as far afield as Quito, Ecuador, or Pretoria, or Kamchatka in the former Soviet Union, or Moncton, Canada, places where there are no Jewish professionals in the local community. Not only do these Israeli education representatives have a powerful impact on Jews of the world, but I want to argue that this is a quintessential peoplehood educational experience in which these young Israelis learn a tremendous amount about other models for Jewish life that ultimately never leave them when they return to Israel. When a secular Israeli spends a summer at a reform camp and is exposed to a form of liberal religious Judaism, relatively undeveloped in Israel, there is evidence that that experience deeply impacts her or his identity and worldview. In addition to the educators Israel can provide, world educators have the opportunity to come to this country, as they do even in this institution. And I believe that in these structures, we are creating a model of Jewish peoplehood for educators and in educational environments that are part of what it means to raise the Jewish peoplehood to a higher common multiple. But it is particularly in the domain of experiences that create passion and engagement that Israel is uniquely able to impact the next generation. From 1948, unmediated personal engagement with Israel has been a way to motivate and inspire Jews. It's in Israel that young Jews can sense, often for the first time, this notion of Jewish peoplehood and what it means to be part of the broader narrative of Jewish history. Exposure to the startling diversity, the rich tapestry of Israeli society, the modern Hebrew language, and the use of Jewish time can have a profound effect on young people, particularly at the significant identity crossroads in which they find themselves. As we meet here this afternoon, on the other side of town at Binyanei Umah, is meeting the steering committee of Taglit, of Birthright. And tonight, if any one of you have the stomach for the enormous decibel level and hormone level of 3,500 members of Birthright packed into Taglit, into a Birthright experience, I think that you will sense, were you to be there tonight, people who come from different communities and from all over the world, I think that you would sense that this program, which many of us had very significant doubts about when it was first created, has become, for people who are often in that third circle of the Jewish world, the marginally affiliated or the unaffiliated, this has become a program that gives people a very deep sense of connection to the Jewish people. So that short-term programs, including Birthright Israel and summer seminars for high school students, seem to have a very, very significant impact on youth at these key identity formation stages. There are close to 80,000 young Jews in an age cohort. The 16-year-old age cohort, 17-year-old age cohort, when we talk about young Jews outside of the State of Israel. And it seems to me that our goal should be that not only should 1 out of every 2 young Jews come to Israel either during their high school years or their college years for a first engagement with Israel, an engagement that is an entry point into Jewish peoplehood, but that we should strive to significantly increase the number of people who come back to Israel on long-term programs. There are very few longitudinal studies in Jewish education in general. But one of the few longitudinal studies that was conducted on graduates of the Young Judea Year course 10 years later when they were 28 years old, and that compared them to people who had applied for the program and then decided not to come, showed that of those who participated in a year program in Israel at that year after high school, and I think this is true about many people who come on their junior year abroad, 91% of those who came on that program in 1988 went on to marry fellow Jews, as opposed to the control group of 48%. 79% belonged to synagogues, as opposed to 43%. Over 70% of those people have come back to Israel, and many and very much higher percentages send their own children to Jewish day schools. It's in fact this logic which led to a historic policy shift by the government of Israel, where for the first time under Prime Minister Sharon, the government of Israel decided to invest major sums in long-term programs for young Jews, investing in the future of the Jewish people, so that Masa, a journey, the gateway to long-term programs, which was launched 2 years ago, has as its goal 1 out of every 4 Jews spending between a semester and a year in Israel, between high school and the age of 30. I want to just mention a very quick vignette. Kivunim, a brand new long-term program in Israel that started this year, started by Peter Geffen of the Heschel School in New York, under the auspices of Masa. It bills itself as being Israel-centered, but not Israel-exclusive. It's based in Jerusalem, a year program, but its students travel abroad once every 6 weeks to study the historical and modern Jewish communities of Lithuania, Russia, Italy, Morocco, Spain, and India. Although Kivunim does not formally label itself as a Jewish Peoplehood initiative, it takes pride in fostering a sense of world consciousness as well as a greater appreciation of other cultures within Jewish life. That's a quote. I'm less interested in answering the question of should an Israel program only spend all of its time in Israel, and intrigued to ask why Kivunim, an initiative focusing on Jewish people that should be based in Israel in the first place. Why not in New York or London or Rome? One could even make the case that it would have made more sense for Kivunim to situate itself outside of the particularistic Zionist narrative if its educational goal is to expose students to the multicultural world in which Jews live. Did Kivunim choose Israel as its base because it's easier to convince parents to send their children to Jerusalem than to persuade them to take off a year and study Jewish people in New York? Is it because it's easier to run a kosher program in Israel than it is in Italy or Spain? I think it's something deeper. I am convinced that the founders of Kivunim intuitively sensed that the concepts of Jewish peoplehood in Israel go hand in hand. Any attempt to educate towards one without the other is not only a lesson in futility, but probably faulty at the core. And I could talk about American Jewish World Service, new initiatives to combine the American Jewish World Service with a stay in Israel, or Amitim. But I want to conclude by saying that there is a paradox in all of this. The paradox is that Israel, as a gateway into Jewish peoplehood, seems to be a gate that opens in one direction only. For diaspora Jews, Israel is indeed a wonderful adventure in Jewish peoplehood, evoking feelings of family, connection, and pride. Yet for Israelis, Israel does not automatically guarantee a greater sense of affiliation with other Jews around the world. On the contrary, for young people who would more readily label themselves as Israelis than Jews, Israel serves as a bubble, isolating and insulating its citizens from the rest of world Jewry. And I could quote from the Gutman report that shows over 10 years the two reports of how young Israelis identify less and less as Jews. I think that the creation of a school for Jewish peoplehood, for Israeli teachers and for young Israelis at Beit Hatfutsoth, is an attempt to actually remedy this side of the equation. So I fundamentally argue that the major challenge facing the Jewish people today, the openness of modernity and the newly voluntary nature of Judaism, that by placing the engagement with Israel at the center of Jewish education as resources, but also as a locus of intrinsic and unique value, Israel has the potential to provide inspiration and motivation for young people to commit themselves to seeking Jewish meaning. Israel education is just one piece of a broader struggle to deal with the issues modernity has imposed on the Jewish community. Yet peoplehood has the potential to be a unifying concept that can encompass all aspects of Judaism, and Israel education may be a significant gateway to Jewish peoplehood. Feelings of Jewish peoplehood are necessary but not sufficient. Emotions are amorphous and difficult to quantify. Actions, on the other hand, are concrete, and I return to the idea of a highest common multiple and asking ourselves, can we really point to mitzvot of Jewish peoplehood? Any discussion of Jewish peoplehood must therefore explore the question, what are these tangible manifestations of this feeling of Jewish unity, these mitzvot of Jewish peoplehood? Thank you very much.
Michael Rosenak is Mandel Professor Emeritus at the Melton Center for Jewish Education of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is also a scholar in residence at the Mandel Institute for Educational and Social Leadership in Jerusalem. Professor Rosenak has spoken widely and is the author of numerous articles and books. His most recent books are Tzarich Iyun, that appeared in Hebrew by the Magnus Press, and Tree of Life, Tree of Knowledge, Westview Press, 2001. His area of specialization is philosophy of education in general and philosophy of Jewish education in particular. He didn't grow up on Habonim in Drum Africa, but he did come. Honorary member. Isn't Ksin Chinuch the other? Yeah. He did come on Aliyah in 1958 and lives in Jerusalem. Bevakasha, Mike.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, going by the common background, I should say, Chavirim, and actually going by the theme of this conference, Peoplehood, I should be saying all this in Ivrit at the Hebrew University. But Minhag Avotenu Biadenu, we started this way, so let's continue. I'd first like to join my colleagues and friends in saying something about Seymour Fox, Zichrono Livracha. Seymour was a very complicated person. And it is not an accident, or it is suitable to him, that he could put together 4 basic concepts as building grounds of education. One, the University of Chicago, and Schwab, and all the Chevra, Hutchins, great books, that whole world. The world of the yeshiva, which he appreciated as being the source of values that we have not even begun to mine out of our tradition. Dewey, somebody might say, mine, Jan Shmita, that's in Har Sinai. How do you put together Dewey and Hutchins? But Seymour did it. And finally, of course, Schwab, his teacher, who has already been alluded to, who originally was a philosopher of science. Seymour was a great humanist, and he took very seriously and had great respect for the world of scientific research. He was complicated, and he presented a way of looking at Jewish life that was complex, but that had a message. Which is to say that Seymour did not believe that you have to have a narrow-minded, clear conception of where you're going, and that everybody should go that way. But in his own way, he managed to open up conversations with many people, with many ideas, with many institutions that he founded, with many colleagues, of which I'm happy to be one. One of the most interesting things to me is we had a lot of different discussions through the course of the years. He was the one who brought me to the Hebrew University. And one of the things that struck me was that while he enjoyed and felt good about the yeshiva world, actually he distanced himself quite a bit from that world, partly in admiration of it. In other words, the admiration was sometimes too great for the skepticism that was also part of his makeup. And yet I think that he showed that you can go his way, his complex way, and end up being more committed, in a certain way more devoted, and certainly a greater source of inspiration for all of us. Now, almost to our topic. Our chairman has said, Alan has said, you have to belong to a certain chavura to be in on this discussion. And I'm sorry that Gidi is not here, because that would have made it even more obvious. It's clear that one of the things that unites all of us here is the Machon Madchei Chutz La'aretz. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Tony for having saved Gidi. When a group of us, senior staff of the Machon Madchei Chutz came to your house and begged Gidi to become the principal of the Machon. And Tony said, why shouldn't he be an academic like everybody? He is an academic. He's an academic person. He's an academic teacher. And hesitantly, he gave in to his better half, which now appears to have been a very smart move. But what is clear is that the boundary lines between the Machon and the university are an intellectual curios of a certain historical epoch. Now I come to my subject. Incidentally, it's not all Habonim. I come from Hashomer HaTzair in its religious version called Hashomer HaDati. Hashomer HaDati, and I'm not ashamed of it. Now, the subject of my talk is a theological treatment of Jewish peoplehood as seen in two thinkers. And I have a certain premise, a certain theory that I want to advance. And that is that theology, on the face of it, is the most uncongenial thing that can go for the concept of peoplehood. Peoplehood is basically a secular, though sometimes religiously sentimental, movement or conception, which says that we're all Jews, we're all in it together. It's not so important what you believe and what, as long as you feel it. It does not care for the definition-seeking, dogma-setting of theology. Theology looks like bad news in the world of peoplehood. And furthermore, Jews don't like the word theology. It sounds too goyish. It's about how you think through doctrines when you should be out in the field planting for the kibbutz. My thesis is that while this is true, that theology seems incongruous to what we're talking about, it turns out that theology or theological systems and ideas can contribute to policy making, to education, and can show what actually is happening in a given intellectual situation. I'm going to try to make this point first with regard to Rabbi Soloveitchik, J.B. Soloveitchik, and his conception of covenant of fate and covenant of destiny, taken from his essay called Dodit Ofek. And I'm going to lightly allude also to Rabbi Dr. Professor Eliezer Berkovits and his concept of faith history. And now we begin. It is now almost 50 years ago since the World Zionist Organization convened its solemn and momentous Jerusalem Ideological Conference. This came out in 1959 as Forum Number 4, publication of the World Zionist Organization. All of us who taught at the Machon know that very well. In this conference of 1957, almost everyone associated with Zionist thought rehearsed well-known doctrines and found themselves sharpening distinctions in the heat of the debate. Almost everybody was there. Ben Gurion, Nahum Goldman, some youngsters like Eliezer Goldman. Some people weren't. Ravid was not there. Hoffman was not there. It might be worth investigating why that was the case, but so it was. It is clear, however, that the concept of peoplehood was writ large over the proceedings, and if I'm not mistaken, it was Kaplan, Mordechai Kaplan, who took a very active role in this conference, who first suggested the idea of the Machon Yadut Zmanenu. I have to check it out, but I'm pretty sure that that's where it comes from. He said, we need a place where people will study about the Jewish people. Now, Kaplan says it very clearly. With the rise of the demand of freedom, hitherto it was assumed that to constitute such a religious people, its members had to abide by a uniform code of beliefs and practices. With the rise of the demand for freedom of thought and the right of individual self-expression, a religious people will have to find ways and means of achieving unity without uniformity. That should not be so difficult for the Jewish people, because in its inexhaustible tradition, which however diversely interpreted and applied, can nevertheless function as a unifying influence. This means that Jewish peoplehood is not a political category, but a moral, spiritual category, and has to be accorded the same status as that of the world religious bodies. So you can't say it much clearer than that. Peoplehood is a way of looking at Jewish existence. Peoplehood comes into the world with certain problems pretty well understood in advance, such as how do you keep a religious people meaningful to itself in an age of secularity, when we can no longer impose standards of normative behavior. Also, of course, Tabenkin made a famous, the socialist kibbutz leader made a famous speech there called "A People, Not a Faith." And we go so far as to find Jacob Pat, the labor Yiddishist American leader, who says, why are they writing off our masses of people and of peoplehood? There are 70,000 socialist Jews, Yiddish speaking, in the United States, when that's the way of the future. Okay. Now, what emerges clearly from the discussion of peoplehood, whether couched in secular Zionist, quasi-religious, or other terms, is that peoplehood was even then in crisis, if only because the masses, or what had come to be known as the Jewish people, had been so massively destroyed by the Nazi enemy, and because the cultural instruments of peoplehood, such as Yiddish, seems to have been moved to the margins. At the first Zionist Congress after the war, Israel Kalabach, the noted Israeli journalist, the founder of Ma'ariv, noted that in the last pre-war Congress, the dominant language had been Yiddish. Then, after the war, it seemed to be mostly English that one heard. Moreover, the champions of peoplehood after the great destruction of the people sounded as though they were defending bastions, sometimes pointedly out of touch with emerging realities. And here I gave the example of Jacob Putt. Yet, despite this crisis, peoplehood appeared to hold great attractive power. One may ask why. Why should anybody be interested? The Israelis seemed not to need it, for they were building a nation. They never claimed that this was a nation. Well, they did claim, but it wasn't taken so seriously that this nationhood that they were building was going to be the nationality of everybody else. After all, the free diaspora, already somewhat removed from East European experience, thought that peoplehood was much like nationhood. And they already were members of liberal nations. So what did they need peoplehood? Who needed it? Except maybe people who get together at conferences and talk about old times. Yet the term still seemed to make some sense to people. It still seemed useful. Why? First of all, for its umbrella-like nature. Somebody here before called it something else, but it's the same idea. Tent, right, tent. Its umbrella-like nature. In the concept of peoplehood, there was room for almost everyone. That doesn't mean that many people wanted to go there, but there was room for it. And there was a blurring of distinctions that could maintain, as it were, the unity of the Jews. Peoplehood engendered warm feelings and genuine commitments in times of catastrophe, in moments of having to stick together, of facing crisis, of celebrating victories. This is here one of the subcategories is turning first to Israel news in the New York Times. What are they doing to us now? Or how should we understand what they are saying about us? So it gave people who did give focus to a sense of shared fate and responsibility. Moreover, in order not to make it look too pedestrian, I will say in the idea of peoplehood there were intimations of some commonality of culture and spirit which carried a moral message, vague enough to win broad acceptance, but seemingly strong enough and important enough to justify continued Jewish existence and to make sense of the difficulties attending the entire enterprise of Jewish survival and identity. In fact, in 1957, peoplehood could be pointed to as still somehow alive, and even very doctrinaire persons would say, well, there was still the rebuilding of the Jewish Commonwealth, and the still inspiring echo, if not universally accepted ethos, of pioneering and settlement. There was a continuing miracle of ingathering and the renaissance of Hebrew. One could still, though less forcefully than 2 decades before, speak of the new Jew who had taken his fate and the future of the Jews as a people into his or her hands. There was still hope that revolutionizing Jewish life would usher in a new epoch in the Jewish saga. Now, with regard to all of this, and I come back to what I said at the beginning, all of this that so clearly bespoke revolution and rebellion and autonomy and renewal, theology could well be perceived as an irritant, an outsider, and an intruder. Theologians and the religious scholars and functionaries in their train seemed to harp on the idea that the Jews were still in principle and in fact different from the nations, and this was because, so said the theological thinkers, because they were still, and in their inner lives and in the significance of their collective existence, the same as they had always been. This is amazing, incidentally. It's not only 12 years after the Holocaust that people say, well, let's see what we mean by monotheism. But right after the war in the displaced person camp, we learned from Zeev, and especially from Zeev, and also from others, the Jews organized themselves in displaced person camps according to their chavura, according to where they belong. There were Havadim people, and there was Poalei Agudat Yisrael, and there was Mizrahi, and there was Ki'ilu lo kara klum b'muvan mesuyam. The basic categories always remain the same. In another address that Alan cited, I traced this back to biblical times, where the kingdom of Israel was destroyed. All right, destroyed. The kingdom of Judah was destroyed. Very bad. The last verses in the book of Kings say that the Ashurite king, the Syrian king, became very kind to the king of Israel, who was his hostage. Who was it? Joachim, I think. Joachim, and had him sit at his table and gave him an allowance. Well, along comes a modern commentary and says, even in this moment of dire distress and great crisis, a ray of hope. Either you can't, nothing is good enough for you, or nothing can be bad enough. So here come along the theologians. They say, Chevra, that's the nature of Jewish existence. And in this conference, there are all kinds of people who are quoted, and who, there's one who doesn't even show up. Rav Zeev, great scholar and Talmudic authority, who explains by mail, because he doesn't want to show up, I think, in this conference, why the only solution for the Jews is Am Levadad Yishkon. You could mention the Holocaust in that connection and say, had we been the Seder, it might have not happened this way. But he, I don't think, does that. He just says, look, that's the principle of our history. The Naziv, Naftali Berlin, already says in his commentary on the Chumash, HaMek Tava, Am Levadad Yishkon. Ubagoyim Lo Yitchashem. If you remain a people alone, you will dwell in safety. You try to be like everybody else, nobody will take it seriously. They don't believe you. And they mistreat you. So here we have the situation that the theologians are saying, basically, the questions that we have to face are normative questions. They are normative questions that are centered in religion, just as in the past. To that identity, the Holocaust constituted a horrific problem, indeed a calamity. But it could not obliterate that identity. Nor from the positive side could the state of Israel create a new identity for the Jews. Rather, they said, the theologians, the state should be seen as an instrument and institution of worldwide Jewry. If the Israelis are going to come along and say they have started a new history, so sein gesund, let them try it. But that has nothing to do with the Jewish people, as we theologians understand it. Most of the religious thinkers, Mordechai Kaplan was a noteworthy exception, sounded as though they negated the peoplehood concept, that insofar as it positive, that it was no longer religion that bound us, but our consciousness of being one people, together confronting continuing threats and together experiencing the occasions for pride and joy as well as suffering trepidations. How does this go along with theology, which, like religion in this age, divides rather than unites? What could champions of peoplehood do with the theologians' claim that even in this secular age, Jews could not do without religious thought and practice? Theologians, when speaking to those Jews who wish to innovate and to change, all too often seem to be dragging them back to myths and memories that were then used to mold eternal obligations and verities. If this is all really so, why did we become modern? Like all children of the Enlightenment. Why did we become Zionists who wanted to open a new page in Jewish history and self-understanding? Certainly modern Jewish peoplehood, expressed with so much vigor from the community center to the kibbutz, was not the place for theologians or theological doctrines. Theology, like any religious serious concern, could indeed ruin everything, because it insisted on seemingly irrelevant distinctions to be drawn, self-serving definitions to be adhered to, specific actions demanded for obtuse reasons. In short, what had religion and religious concerns as such to do with the life of peoplehood, with its consciously secular overtones, despite its sometimes effusive and sentimental love for traditional life, its agenda of non-interference in the ways Jews lived their Judaism, with or without belief in God, with or without commitments. This conference was held 12 years after the Holocaust, surely a time that seemed like a time for action and response after initial reflection. Yet not a few of the speakers insisted on clarifying the character and sensibilities of the Jews as a faith and a religious entity. Thinkers like Hoffman and Buber had been doing this for years, and now younger thinkers like Leibowitz and Eliezer Goldman proceeded to join them. Thus, in this conference on the problems of Zionism, Jewry, and the State of Israel, we find that Buber speaks of the Jewish nation as required by its unique existence to devote its entire being to the kingdom of God. We find Leibowitz ridiculing the Jewishness of a state that does not base its self-understanding completely on the centrality of the divine commandments as formulated in the Halakha, as the only unique content of authentic Jewish life. And we hear Eliezer Goldman, a young analytic philosopher and religious kibbutz member, insisting that facts, even facts of peoplehood, impose no obligation, but that only what is believed to be obligatory is obliging. And what Alan before mentioned, the descriptive and the prescriptive. Goldman would say, peoplehood is prescriptive. We're under pressure. We feel more comfortable, for whatever reasons, being among Jews. Ze lo mechayev. The only thing that can create a commitment, is something that you believe to be normative. As for obligation, even the people, and this is a quote from Goldman, even the people as a historical identity is not the object of obligations, even though some spokesmen for peoplehood blur the boundaries between the historic existential and the normative. Due to outside pressure such as persecution, economic discrimination, and exclusion, a situation may be created wherein one cannot escape, but that is the result of circumstance, not obligation. As for obligation, Goldman writes, there are Jews such as myself who do not recognize the right of any Jew to free himself from the yoke of any mitzvah. If such Jews encourage others who are far from Judaism to cultivate what is close to their hearts and regard them as their brothers, it is not because they recognize their right to free themselves from the mitzvot, but because they recognize the concept of, they understand the concept of Am Yisrael as including those who do not observe the norm. Is the willingness of some Orthodox Jews to consciously adhere to an Am Yisrael that includes the non-religious merely a gesture of kindness, or is it an inescapable norm? Those are open questions. Is the striving for normality, as Buber insisted, a prescription for national religious insignificance and virtual disappearance? Can there, as Leibowitz claimed, be no Judaism in the State of Israel that does not recognize the unique Jewish status of the Halakha? And we hear those who disagree with the theological analyses saying, you are undermining what remains of an experienced Jewish identity. To which we hear the theologians responding, modernity and Zionism cannot change the nature of the Jewish tradition. Had Simon Ravidovich been there, and he wasn't, he would have added that you cannot take the word Israel and have it signify a mere state. Israel, he insisted, is the name of our people and its faith. We are Israel because we remember being at Sinai, not because the Zionist movement made a declaration to that effect. Now I go to, how much time? Yes. שמעתי 15? Yeah, okay.
I'm having fun.
You're having fun, okay. For an analysis of the thought of one theological thinker with regards to peoplehood and the questions a theological theory such as his may raise for deliberation, I turn now to Rabbi Joseph D. Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik is not often cited either as commentary on the idea of Jewish peoplehood, neither in its general manifestations, nor in its Zionist ones. Rabbi Soloveitchik was, for much of the 20th century, the primary mentor of what came to be called modern Orthodoxy in North America, and some would say its great founding figure. Soloveitchik delivered a Hebrew address entitled Kol Dodi Dofek on Yom Ha'atzmaut of 1956 at Yeshiva University, or rather at the Yeshivat Yitzhak Elchanan of Yeshiva University. And the soon-to-be renowned address showed Soloveitchik a staunch defender of the ideal of Torah as Orthodox religious vision, of the Halakha as the locus of Jewish thought and practice, and the singular status of the people of Israel as the recipient of revelation and bearers of an impeccable tradition. At the same time, he clearly recognized the need for dealing with the post-World War world in which the Jews lived in the wake of the Holocaust, a world also in which the Jews had been granted a state. This was an event that he considered to rest on the ground of divine providence, thus requiring, or thus making halachic demands on Jews. Yet he insists on approaching it from within a typology that was theological, and that he believed to offer an integrated model of religious life and reality. Now this I'd like to depart from the paper, also because of the shortness of time. Rabbi Soloveitchik inevitably and invariably thought in typologies. There's the first Adam, and there's the second Adam. There's the man of halakha, and there's the man of religion. All of these typologies are supposed to come together somehow, and one of them, the one that we have in front of us now, is between what he calls the covenant of fate, F-A-T-E, the covenant of fate and the covenant of destiny. The covenant of fate is what happens is a certain required response of Jews to the situations where they are acted upon by others, where they can respond heroically, but where the origins of the situation is in the actions of others. Anti-Semitism, discrimination, whatever you have. Slavery in Egypt is a situation of fate, and it gives rise to a covenant of fate, because the fate situation requires a certain response. For Rabbi Soloveitchik, every religious act is a halachic response. Now, this covenant of fate, because it is completely incorporated into the religious theological system, carries its own mitzvot with it, carries its own obligations, carries its own narratives, its own master stories, as Fowler would say. For example, the Torah makes a distinction between a machaneh and a dah, between a camp and a community. You will not be surprised to hear that the community of faith has as its central concept machaneh, camp, ready for war, or ready to be counted in the census, which might be getting ready for war. On the other hand, the Brit Milah is part of the covenant of faith. Nobody asked the poor kid whether he wanted to be circumcised on the 8th day of his life. Pesach represents the covenant of faith because God took us out. As a matter of fact, took us out at night. We were passive. We did not live in the daytime of the situation, but in the night. This covenant of faith unites all Jews. And such questions as, is this person religious enough, or pious enough, or observant enough, does not arise, because the covenant of faith is that you have to look upon all Jews as being part of that same faith. But there's a second covenant, which he calls the covenant of destiny. The covenant of destiny has as its paradigm not the liberation from Egypt, but the standing at Mount Sinai. The willingness and ability for the people as a united body to say Naseh v'nishma. And of course, here you don't have the Machaneh, here you have the Eidah. And going one step further, not only is the symbol of it not Brit Milah, but Tfilah, immersion in the mikveh. Because that is something that a person consciously goes to. So, he writes here particularly of situations or in context of conversion. And while a male must be circumcised also before conversion, both males and females will go to the mikveh, because this is the halakha of the covenant of destiny. Okay, now, for Soloveitchik, it is not simple to belong to the community of faith. And he says the following: what have I, a devotee of the Talmudic school of Brisk, to do with the likes of Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann? But the Holocaust, he believed, sets a posek halakha, sets a halakhic ruling of Zionist affiliation. And in line with this, I must note that he was long an honorary president of the Mizrahi in the United States, which was a very bold thing for a Rosh Yeshiva to do. If you add 2 minutes, I'll tell the anecdote.
1.5.
Oh, thanks. Okay. In 1982, before the vote on whether to have a commission of inquiry on Sabra and Shatila, there was a meeting in the office of Zvulun Hammer to discuss how the Miflaga Datit Leumit should vote in favor or against. Most of the people said, we should be in favor of this commission of inquiry. Terrible thing has happened. There were a few people who said, when Goyim kill Goyim, the Jews have to have commissions of inquiry. We know this line. Suddenly, Yosef Burg, the senior minister of the Mavdal, was called out of the room. And he came back a few moments later and he said, that was Rabbi Soloveitchik from Boston. He says, we're voting for a commission of inquiry, or I resign as president of the Mizrahi. Now, this commission of inquiry, if we do a little bit of an analysis here, this commission of inquiry belongs to the covenant of destiny. Because destiny is supposed to be in line with our vision. It's supposed to lead us to the kingdom of God. It's supposed to lead us to the Yemot HaMashiach. And therefore we cannot betray the covenant of destiny even in a moment of covenant of faith, where it's more convenient to say, well, Goyim kill Goyim, so we have to have a commission of inquiry. Okay, now, basically, this is the concept that I wanted to present to you, but I wanted to develop a little bit further. It's a paradigm which I'd like to call contained pluralism and limited unity, because actually there's supposed to be no real in-depth relationship between the community of destiny and the community of faith. if the community of faith is presented as a concept that makes possible peoplehood, Rabbi Soloveitchik wants only a little bit of that, as much as is necessary. And what is going to happen when the people of destiny are going to join with the people of faith? The assumption seems to be that there'll be no spiritual contact between them. They'll just work together. But what if there's some influence, some mutual influence? What if it turns out that the person of the community of destiny, that is Rabbi Soloveitchik's community of destiny, discovers that among some of his colleagues from the community of faith, there's also a concept of destiny, even though it's not his. In other words, maybe there are other spiritual possibilities besides the one that Rabbi Soloveitchik represents. But finally, I want to say there are two problems that are even greater. One, the covenant of destiny makes it appear as natural and good, and in the long run, good for the Jews, that there be faith all the time. In other words, somebody said to me right after Arafat died, what are we going to do now? What's going to be our self? In other words, the ideology of the community of faith is, Baruch Hashem, they hate us. But what if they don't? And this is not only amusing on my part, but the same covenant that talks about faith also talks about all nations coming up to the mountain of the Lord. In other words, it has to be destiny that holds things together, because young people who are told by their leaders now that you must be rallied, join the camp, may say, well, wait a moment, maybe this is manipulative. Maybe this is manipulative. Maybe it's possible to now walk away from it, as Alan described so graphically. So you cannot build a historical vision of Jewish life on the covenant of faith. Now, in the time of Mount Sinai, it was possible to bring all the Jews together to one place, and they all sat together, now seven Nishma. But today, we have, and Professor Walter pointed it out, we have many avenues, or many, we have many locuses, loci, of covenant of destiny, whether it's Chabad, and whether it's New Age, or whether it's Karlbach, or whatever. We have many kinds of community of destiny. But while they strengthen the conception of destiny, they work against peoplehood. Because each of these conceptions of destiny sees itself as exclusively authentic. That doesn't mean that they don't invite people in. But they have no patience with those who don't want to come in. Which means also that there is no theory of pluralism among those who take the covenant of destiny very seriously. And this is something that has to be taken into account. I'm finished. It has to be taken into account, and the recipe that suggests itself is that ways have to be found, first of all, to strengthen those aspects of destiny that we have in common, and there are a few, largely thanks to Zionism, like Hebrew, which we don't speak because it's our fate, but we speak because we want to say something Jewish in it. So that's number one that we have to do. Number two, we have to find a way for young Jews and not so young Jews to be committed, but not to base the commitment on the dislike of everybody else. Yitzhak Greenberg once said that he hears that conservative Jews say that in 100 years from now there will be no Reform Jews, and the Reform Jews say there will be no conservative Jews, and they all say there will be no Orthodox Jews except for the Orthodox, of course. And Greenberg's question is, what if they're all right? what are we left with then? Okay, so here what I try to do here is to show how theology can be a different take on questions that are educational questions and policy questions. As for my second theologian, who comes from a completely different direction, on another occasion. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take some comments. This is your time. Sorry that we made it a little shorter, but comments, questions, theologies, please.
Just try and make this very brief. Just a comment or question both to Alan. In terms of the three elements that you talked about, which I'm very involved with at the University of Sydney, which is educators, training educators, ensuring good content, and the experience which one can only have in Israel. But I'd like to, Alan, ask you about a fourth dimension that I think we need to put on the table, even though it may relate more to the next session, and that's research, educational research. You mentioned that there'd been very few longitudinal studies, and you quoted just one. How do we make it that in a Jewish world that did produce people like Schwab, so many great educational thinkers, we are not yet respecting enough, it seems to me, educational research, which means encouraging our educators to move into second degrees and third degrees, and to ensuring a very good nexus between university studies and school teachers. If I can, that's my question to Alan. I think it's something that it burns me all the time, the issue of bringing up the value of research. Just sharing an experience on issues of Jewish peoplehood from the Australian end that relates to the three areas you talked about, and which is a project with Melton that I think people may want to know about. In Australia, we've just got a Pinchas grant together with the Melton Centre of bringing a program of training Eretz Israel studies with virtually every high school in Australia, Jewish high school, participating, where teachers are being trained with Melton staff to introduce Israel studies into some element of the curriculum. And that program is taking place both with teachers in Australia, but the teachers also were brought to here last year in June, July. I've been involved with evaluating. I think it's a very exciting model that perhaps other communities in the world might want to look at. Thanks.
Before Ken?
I would quote way before Soloveitchik or Berkovits such people as Saadia Gaon over 1,000 years ago, who said the only thing that makes the Jews a people is the Torah. And I experienced it personally. I think I have more in common in many ways with an American from Boston than with a Yemenite. In culture, food, ways of responding, feeling, but the fact that if we're both observant of God's law, that gives us a certain sense of mission and destiny together. And in light of that, I'd like to add just a short bit to what I said yesterday, that the various attempts at Jewish peoplehood, arousing Jewish consciousness, I think really stem from a search for God when the particular sociological halachic community somehow just can't be lived with, but that the people are searching for God. So I would evaluate the Jewish education of all sorts in how much does it satisfy this need for connecting to our eternal divine mission of Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah Devar Hashem Yerushalayim.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to respond to Suzanne and say that
I think that, Suzanne, clearly it does belong to the next session, but because it belongs to the higher education session. But I do want to say something about research and some of the issues that I spoke about. I think that we do not fully understand what actually happens in this black box that's called the Israel experience. And I think that if you read the birthright research, or you read some of the longitudinal stuff that I talked about, of which there is very little, I think what has not been done well at all has been to try to unpack the degree to which the personal engagement with Israel is indeed about Jewish peoplehood in a way that I try to indicate. I think that we have some kind of evidence and personal testimony about that, and I think that if you ask me about research, and it's something that if I would have had more time, I would have talked about the limits of the model that I'm talking about. This is something that I think we hypothesize about, and we know it intuitively, and I think that when you hear that the overwhelming birthright participants, when they fill out their evaluation form, overwhelmingly non-observant participants say that the visit to the Kotel was the single most powerful experience that they had. I suspect that there is something here about a sense of connection to Jewish people and Jewish history, which is part of the total experience of Israel. It has not been well enough understood. There is very little of the kind of social psychological kind of research. So I think there are pieces of research that need to be done to really take what I'm talking about and to examine it more. I also want to say one other thing about that, which is also related to the discussion of this morning. Because one of the things that was said this morning is that young people are, and I mentioned it today as well, young people are growing away from Israel, and yet one sees that Israel seems to have such an impact on young people, on young people's sense of themselves as Jews, not so much even to their connection to Israel. And I think that's connected to the topic of our, in a strange way, to the topic of our conference, myth or reality. And I think that in some way, the educational process is actually quite successful at the mythic level. And I'm not so sure that for education, we need to think about these in these kind of either-or categories.
I want to thank our presenters for actually leaving us with some questions and not just with answers. We're going to make history in this conference and finish 5 minutes before time. When we add that to the 10 minutes before we will open the next one at 5:10, you will get 15 minutes to have coffee in the next room. Gather your energies and see you at the next session. בתי ספר, כל הספקטרום.
כמה זמן אתם קיימים? אני יודעת.
פרויקט חדש.
כן? יפה מאוד.
בעצם באופן פורמלי רק השיקו אותו לפני חודש וחצי. אנחנו בתחילת הדרך. אנחנו בתחילת הדרך, אבל אני אשמח. שלחי לי אימייל ונקבע.
בסדר גמור, יופי. ושיהיה בהצלחה, זה הכי חשוב.
תודה רבה.